So let's work on those watercolor techniques. So I gave you 2 sheets that will be in that email. These are a lot bigger than what I'm going to show you right now because I want to just kind of go and refresh your memory on how we did all this. So we'll start on this first page and we'll work our way across. When you're getting ready, I want you to make sure that your paint is very syrupy, melted syrup. So we're going to really get inside that well and dig out all of that color. Now I'm going to speed this up. So you can see I keep going back to my well and really grabbing more color because I want that really thick paint for most of these things that we're doing. You can see on my palette how it really separates when it's really watery, but you can see it's starting to get thicker and it's not separating as quickly, and that's how I know that we're getting to the consistency that I want. Once you've got that consistency, you can start painting. So this is wet on dry. Basically, you're just going to have wet paint on dry paper. You can paint any shape you want. I'm just kind of doing a leaf shape or a petal shape. That is all you do. Making sure to give my brush a good rinse. Now let's move on to wet on wet. We're going to lay down some water. Remember, when you do this technique, you have little control because it goes where it wants to go. So let's lay down that plain water, or that plain paint, and you're going to see how it just spreads. And as this dries, it's going to spread even more. So just keep watching that as we do it. Now this next one is going to be this charging one, or where we drop in paint. So you want to do this when it's wet. You can grab the same color, tap it in wherever you want that color to be. Maybe at the bottom you want it to be darker, or at the top or the side. You can grab a different color. So I've grabbed a little bit of dark purple, and I'm even going to put in some light pink here. And that's just going to give you this really cool effect on whatever you are painting. Now this next one is called it's called glazing. And I'm going to lay down this color. It needs to be a very light color. So I'm going to paint kind of a little flower here so that you can see how that works. Now the importance of this thing is that we have to make sure that it is a light color and that it completely dries before we lay that next layer. So I'm going to move ahead. I'll come back later. Now this next one is called touching paint or poking paint. And you're going to do this with 2 different colors. And I'm going to lay down just plain water first because when I do this technique, I like to do it with just plain water, but you can do it with color. I'll do it both ways. Now I'm grabbing some of that same blue. It's that syrupy blue. And I'm going to lay this down. I'm going to get really close to that edge of the water. And then I'm just going to lay it and kind of poke it in there. And it's going to do these blooms that are really fun to watch up close. And you can go up as high as you want. So you can see I'm adding that in. And then you can always come back in and add some more color. But it just bursts. It just gives you this nice little burst. And it's kind of fun to do. Now let me show you with 2 different colors. I'm going to do it with a pink and a yellow. Yellow, for some reason, is a very strong color. So usually it works really well when going into another color. But of course that depends on your brand of paints, things like that. Same technique, lay down your first color. We want it to be syrupy wet. I'm going to grab that yellow from my palette over here, and I'm going to lay it below just like this. And then I'm going to get close and I'm going to touch that yellow, and it's just going to start to bloom up. Again, this is that poke method. It's fun to play with. It's really pretty on flowers. Now the next technique that we're going to do is the drag. I do like this drag a lot. I tend to use it the most when I paint. So I'm going to grab that syrupy blue and some plain water after I lay down the blue. So I'm going to grab this. I'm going to paint the bottom of my petal first. Oh yeah, I decided to draw it so that you could kind of see where I was going with this, although I'm going to go outside those lines completely. So I'm going to grab that blue, that syrupy blue, and lay it down at the base of my petal. You could do this with whatever. We do this in one of the projects on Get Set Up where we paint the potted plant. So we're going to lay down that color. It's a really nice, thick, syrupy color. Now you can see I'm tapping it in because I want to make sure it's nice and watery. And then I'm going to rinse my brush really good and just grab some plain water. And then we're going to lay that right down at that line, and we are just going to drag that color upwards, just like that. And you can do as much dragging as you want. My hand gets in the way there a little bit. I'm just kind of evening out the sides of that petal. And it's going to move. Remember, these are wet on wet techniques. You don't have a whole lot of control because it's water and paint, and they kind of do what they want to do with that wet paper. You can come back in and do the drop-in method, add more color. You can drag that up some more. Just play around with that until you get a really good feel. So this next technique I really like, and this is where we're going to remove paint. So we're just going to lay down some color. And I don't want it to be sopping wet when I do this, so I'm going to lay that down and kind of let it dry. For this one, this is going to be the paper towel one, so we do want it to be nice and wet. So you're just going to grab a paper towel edge and tear it off, and then you can just go in and remove color as you see fit. This is great for making clouds too, by the way. This is how I love to make my clouds. You can remove as much color as you want. It gives you lots of texture. Now on the one over here I'm going to show you with my paintbrush, I don't know if there's something weird on my paper. That's why it's got that weird splotch right there. But just try to ignore it. So I'm coming in with a very dry brush. So I've cleaned my brush and dried it off. And as you can see, you can paint an entire painting like this, which is really cool. You could put in little texture marks. You can remove an entire center of it as you want. Just make sure that your brush is clean. You don't want to drag that color. You don't want it to be too wet. See how it's kind of puddling down there at the bottom? So just be careful. And then dry your brush off really good. But doing it that way too can give you a really cool texture down there at the bottom. And you can always come back in and lay color on top of that. You can leave it white. You can do whatever you want. Here I'm just laying down some yellow. So I'm going back in here. And it's just going to give me this really kind of cool green color. This is great for leaves, petals, whatever. When we're painting, we do like to have texture in there. It just makes our work that much more interesting. Now we'll move on to the next page that has these, starting with our flat wash. Now with this, I like to use a flat brush, although you can do it with a round brush. I just think a flat brush, I like it a little bit better. Now if you're doing this on something like flowers or whatever, you might want to use a round brush. But I'm just going to lay this color down. Now this can be used for a background, yes, but don't think that's the only way you can do it. You can use this as a first layer or third layer, whatever layer you want for your flowers. Notice I'm moving the paint in directions up and down and trying to get it so that it is completely even. I'm going to pull off a little of that paint because it's a little watery. I'm trying not to have brush strokes in it. It will settle a little bit, so you kind of got to just play with it. So that's a nice flat wash that I did right there. You got to be careful though, if you wait too long. See how I removed that color right there? And I'm going to have all those brush strokes. Now I can come back and kind of fix it. But when you're painting something, you got to be careful and know when to stop so that you don't get all of those brush strokes in there. So we did this technique kind of earlier with the petal, but let's do it with just plain paper so that you can really see how doing that touching in method works. So you're going to start just by laying some plain water down on your paper. No puddles, please. It just gets too wet. Make it nice and shiny, no puddles. And then I'm going to put some water on my brush, and I'm going to grab that syrupy blue that we've been using, and then I can just touch it to this paint and watch those blooms explode. This is so much fun to do for me for some reason. When I'm in a mood or just don't know what to paint, I love doing this. It just brings me such joy. I don't know why, it just does. You can push your brush down even further and get different kinds of blooms. You could do this for a background, for texture. The longer you hold your brush on there, the bigger your blooms will be. Play around with just barely touching it and then holding it down and then even pushing your brush. So let's move on to the next one. We're going to do a monochromatic gradient. And so you're going to start with that syrupy color. It's nice and kind of thick, very heavily pigmented. And then you're going to do a nice dip into your water, going just over the bottom of that. So we're getting it to be a little bit watery. You can always go back up and move things up or down as you need to. And now I'm going to clean my brush out really good and then make sure all I have is clear water, doing the same thing, grabbing that and then pulling it down. I can go back up, I can go back down, however I feel I need to do this. But what this does is it gives you that value of darkest to lightest. These are really great for sunsets. But not only that, you can do this on petals too. Now let's do it with just some color so I can kind of show you how to do this. The one thing you want to be careful of when doing is not to mix too much color. And so the way to do that is to grab your next color. I'm going to do this with an orange. See how I started below and then I go up into that color and the two will create that ombre effect. And I'm going to do it with some yellow as well. Notice I'll start below. That way we're not dragging the orange down with us. We're going up so we have some pure yellow. And then we'll grab that orange and it will slide down into it. Very nice. Also, again, sunsets, sunrises, flowers. Kind of just play around with it and see how you want to do it. So now we're going to add some salt to our work. So we're just going to lay down anything we want. Maybe you want this to be a background. Maybe you want it to be a textured snowflake. And I'm just going to show you how you can do this with as many colors as you want. You could do it with one plain color. Here I'm just going crazy. This is also something really fun to just play around with. It's also great if you're trying to explain science to somebody, because it deals with absorption, because this salt that we're going to use is really going to absorb this. Now you can use regular table salt, you can also use sea salt, and you just liberally apply that wherever you want it to go. Then you have to let that thing dry. It won't work unless it's perfectly dry. Allow that salt to really absorb what you're doing and you can get an incredible background. And under the ocean, a night sky, or wherever your imagination will take you. Now the next one is called a dry brush. And for this, you can use a raggedy old brush that you've had that's disintegrated. You can use a new brush, but if you have old brushes, it's great. So we're going to get some paint on that, some pigment. Now I'm going to really dab this and really get all the water off of it I can. And then we're just going to rub it across our paper and you get this lovely dry brush effect. What is this good for? Maybe you want to do some grass. As you get better, you could do hair on an animal or just use it to texture a flower to get all those beautiful textures that would run through a flower. Now let's go back up to some of the ones that we did earlier. Look at that wet on wet up here. Look how it's really dispersed. Let's do our glazing. So we laid down that really light blue. So now I'm going to lay a really light purple on top. You don't want this to be super wet, but you don't want it to be really dry. And I noticed that I need a darker purple, so I grabbed a little bit more color. And I'm just laying that over top. So I'm just making some petals in between these. But what we really want to do with this glazing technique is that we want to see the underneath flower. And that is why you do this. Not my favorite technique, but I'm going to show you this that I did earlier. It's on your sheet as well. And it can just be a really lovely flower. If you outline things with pen, I think it looks really nice, actually, and you get some cool effects. And let's just finish up our techniques with a really fun one. This is spatter. Some people call it splatter. And I'm noticing that green leaf where I took some of that color out and added that yellow. That just is beautiful to me, as well as the one next to it. So I'm going to lay down some water here. And the reason why is I want you to see how you can do it to both a wet surface, and you could also do this to a dry surface. A lot of artists love to put spatters on their paintings at the end. It's kind of a big thing right now. I'm not sure why, but I think I want to show it to you just in case you want to do it. So this time you want a nice paint that's not too thick, but of course not too thin, but thinner than that syrup, just by a little bit. So I'm grabbing that, making sure that my brush is fully loaded. I have another brush here, and all I'm going to do is swipe down across it, and I'm going to get that spatter all over. Now you do have to be careful if you don't want it all over your painting of kind of maybe laying down some other paper. Now look at the difference between the dry and then the wet, because those are two different techniques that you might want to try. Just be careful not to overdo it. You can have too much spatter, friends. Happy painting!